This morning, I want to talk about politics. I know, I'm not supposed to do that, am I? More precisely, I want to talk about how we as Christians approach politics. And one of the things that I really strive to do in ministry is stay away from this whole hot take thing where it's like, this event is happening, therefore I have a response and I must say something about it. What I really strive for is if you come back 10 years from now and you listen to the same sermon again, you think, yeah, that still makes sense. It's still a workable framework. And you might also think, my insomnia is so much better after listening to this sermon. I like to think it's restful. But what I want to do is look at these issues, look at some of the stuff that faces us today through the lens of AMOS. AMOS was one of the minor prophets. And when we talk minor and major prophets, we're not talking were they better or worse, we're talking about how much they wrote. So you got the major prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and they write these long books. And guys like Amos and Micah and Obadiah, they write these short books. Amos is only 7 chapters long. And what happens is God calls Amos to be a prophet. And frankly, he's not real happy about it. He's like, look, I'm a vine dresser, not a prophet, not a son of a prophet. But God calls him to say these things. It's about 700 years before Jesus, and he's working in the time of the divided kingdom. So you've got the 12 tribes have split into 2 nations. After Solomon dies, the 10 northern tribes rebel, and so they go their own way. And then you've got the 2 southern tribes centered around Jerusalem. And Amos is from the northern area of the southern nation, and God calls him to go north. And God gives him a few things to say. So when he gets there, he starts telling the people of the 10 tribes, here's what's gone wrong. And he lays out all the nations around the 10 northern tribes, and he says, and here's their problem, and here's their problem, and it's like he's drawn a big bullseye with those 10 tribes in the center. And he says, here's what you need to do. You need to hate evil, love good, and establish justice at the gate, that it may be the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. And by remnant of Joseph, he's talking about these 10 tribes. He's saying, here's what you need to do. And he said, even though you offer me, he's speaking as God here, God is speaking through him. Even though you offer me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, and the peace offerings of the fattened animals, I will not look upon them. What God is saying, he's saying, look, you go do the forms, you sing the songs, you make the prayers, you make the offerings, but your heart's not in it. The argument is you're just going through the motions. And God's saying, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for you to say the right things for 1 hour a week on Sunday and then go live your life as if I don't exist. I'm not playing that, is what God is saying. And he finishes this section with this great line, but let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like a never-failing stream. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? And that's what I want to talk about today. How do we as Christians interact with our society? We live in a society where secular authorities make laws, make rules, make regulations. How do we interact with that? And often we get tempted to go one way or the other. And I want to dive into it this morning and give us a theological lens for how do we follow God's command in this very messy world. And I want to start here. I think the real divide in America is not between conservative and liberal, not between Democrat and Republican, not between red and blue, not even between Aaron Rodgers and reality. Oh, come on, I had to make one joke, okay? Just one. But the real divide is between the people who have politics as a passion and a lifestyle and the rest of us. There's been a number of really interesting studies that come out recently. And somewhere around 14% of Americans are thinking about politics every day. You're passionate, you're engaged, you're writing to your congressman, you're out knocking on doors, you're doing stuff online, you're doing stuff through social media every day. And then there's the rest of us who are not that. And that's the divide I want to talk about. And I want to speak to both sides of that and offer some encouragement and warning to both sides of that. And let's start with those of you who live politics as a passion. And I want to give you this interesting Lutheran paradox. You see, one of the gifts of Lutheran theology is this thing we call law and gospel. And the way it is laid out in Lutheran theology, and this is one of the reasons I love Lutheran theology, is that what we say is you can't, but you don't have to. I'll give you the classic example. We always teach the confirmation kids, so you guys take notes on this for your worship notes. You'll be good, okay? You see, we say, okay, first commandment, you shall have no other gods. Well, what does this mean? It means you don't worship money or power or relationships or beauty or fame or any of those other things. You're not supposed to worship it. But here's the other half of it. You don't have to. And what we're saying is, when you aren't as popular, you aren't as famous, you're not as beautiful, you're not as rich as you think you should be, you're still loved by God. And your worth is not determined by that. So here's the paradox. We so get invested in this. We so want to strive to see our preferred political options, and we do these things that our ministry gets lost. I get about once a year, somebody says to me, Pastor, do you know what people in this congregation are posting on social media? And I'm like, no, I don't, because I'd rather cut off my own toes with a hacksaw than be on social media. I had a more graphic metaphor, but my wife said I was not allowed to say that in church. She was right, but I'm still disappointed. But the thing is, some of us who feel very passionate about this get very vocal on social media and in other ways. And because we do that, our message gets lost. We can't hear what you have to say because you are so strident, so upset, so angry about some injustice. And I understand where that comes from, but it's a detriment to the ministry. I was a pastor in a church where the previous pastor, because he was not of a social media generation, he was lived and ministered prior to that, constantly wrote letters to the newspaper. And they would publish his letters in the newspaper on a regular basis. And he would weigh in on every issue. And it was interesting because I had congregation members say, you know, because he weighs in on so many things, we can't hear him preach the gospel anymore. We can't hear him talk about Jesus anymore. His message got lost. It's a sad thing. And so what I want to do is I want to give you the flip side of that warning. And I want to say, it's going to be okay. Think about the beautiful imagery that we have at the end of the book of Revelation. We get this wonderful image of a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. And I want you to pay attention to the verbs there. It is coming down. It is not being built up. God gives us this perfect world. Yes, we are called to do justice. Yes, we are called to do all these things. Yes, we are called to make this a better thing. But fundamentally, the salvation of this world is not in our hands. And when we think it is, we are putting our hands in the place of God. There are two strands of theology that get way too focused on the end times. And one of them is this belief called, I got to think about this, postmillennialism, where we believe that we build up this perfect world here. And that denies the belief that we are sinful, fallen human beings. And the other strand is this idea that is all awful, but we have to make it happen, and it's never going to be okay. And you get that in the premillennialist strain. The reality is, it is a gift from God. To say otherwise is to go back to the beginning of the Bible. Go back to the Tower of Babel. And what were they trying to do then? They were trying to build a towering city to reach up to heavens. And God just looked down at that like, nah, I don't think so. Like, I got something better. And so for those of you who are passionate and live and breathe in politics, keep striving for justice, but understand ultimately it's in God's hands. So I want to shift gears now for a minute, and I want to make the rest of us uncomfortable. That 14% has had their turn. Now it's time for the rest of us. You see, when you read these studies of American society where they talk about this 14% that's engaged and passionate and constantly doing these things, constantly out campaigning and knocking on doors, the term they use for the rest of us is the exhausted majority. And it's not a political position. The way they frame this is you got people across the whole theological spectrum. It's temperamental, and it's you've got your life to live, and you don't want to get wrapped up in all these things. And how many of us have been in that situation where you're thinking, I just don't want to keep fighting over this. I just don't want to keep arguing about this. I had a friend of mine, I was talking to her back in California. This was a number of years ago, and I was living in California. And I said something about watching the Vikings game, and she's like, I don't watch football because the players kneel during the national anthem. And I'm like, okay, whatever. They don't show that on TV anymore. And then I say something about having to go to Target after work. And she's like, I don't go to Target anymore because of their bathroom policy. And I'm like, okay, how many more of these things are we going to go through today? Beautiful weather outside, isn't it? And it's one of these things where sometimes you might agree with what a person has to say and you might agree with their positions, but you're just like, I don't want to talk anymore. I don't want to argue about it anymore. And the temptation is just to keep your head down. And you might just be like, I don't want to deal with it. And I don't want to have a position out there because I'm afraid I'm going to get mistaken for those crazies on that side or that side. How do we engage? And the temptation so often is just not to. But that's not the biblical witness. That's not what God tells us to do. From the very beginning of the story, from the time of Abraham, God says to Abraham, I am going to use you and your family as an instrument of righteousness and justice. Right there in Genesis, 4,000 years ago, God has been calling us to do this. Proverbs 31, let me read this to you. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of those who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. And there in Amos, God is saying to the people of the north, you people are trampling on the poor. That's the verb that gets used. You're trampling. I was like, ouch. And what God is saying to us is don't worry about what people think of you. Stay engaged and make this a better world. Because these people who are being trampled are as much made in the image of God and are loved as much by God. And Jesus died for them just as much as he died for you and I. We are called as a people to be salt and light in this world. And so we don't want to just hide out. We don't want to say it's just us. We are called to bless this community and bless this world. And if that means occasionally that you get misidentified politically, you know what? It's okay. Because the thing for us as Christians is to look and say, where are we called to serve? Who are we called to bless? We've got that big old pile of boxes there, and we had this massive crew here this weekend where we were packing over 1,000 boxes to bless kids across the world. And we want to remember that we are always called to bless kids and bless the poor and bless this world. Now, I got one more person to make uncomfortable. Yeah, indeed. Kid got that one right. And that's me. Because why should I have all the fun of making you guys uncomfortable? There's something related to this that I've been increasingly convicted on. And that's this. I have gotten my sons well-trained enough to say that we don't vote for incompetent narcissists and that all politicians are pretty much incompetent narcissists. Okay? And what I was realizing is, and what I was convicted, because I read and think a lot about these things, is that when we do that, and we treat all politicians and public servants in that fashion, it drives out the good people who want to serve. When we make the assumption that everybody's working out of their own venal motives, when everybody is just self-centered and in it just for a platform, we drive out the people who honestly want to serve. Paul writes this great thing that we are supposed to pray for the people in authority. We're supposed to ask that God give them grace and wisdom. And that's a hard thing to do. I got to admit, for 20, 30 years, when I've read that verse, I always think of the great line from Fiddler on the Roof. When they say, is there a blessing for the czar? They say, yes, God bless the czar and keep him far, far away from us. That's generally how I want to pray for people in power. God bless them and keep them far, far away. But what I've become convicted on is that we need to pray for people in power. We need to encourage them. We need to say, you know, I might disagree with you on X, Y, and Z, but we pray that you lead justly and that you lead as God called you with wisdom. I have a friend of mine who's serving as a city council person in southern Minnesota. And I was thinking about him in context with this, because he will be the first to tell you that there are some incompetent narcissists on that city council, but also that there's some really good people, some people who have the city's heart, some people who want to bless that community. And it's a little convicting for me, because I want to write all those folks off. But we are called to love every member of this community, the poor, the destitute, those in power. We are called to love them as God has first loved us. And so wherever you lie on that continuum I was talking about earlier, I hope you're challenged and blessed by this, knowing that you have the freedom to love this world, the freedom to share God's grace with the people around you, regardless of any political ideology, regardless of where they come from. And our hope and our prayer is that justice rolls like water. Amen.